All right, well, let's get started. Well, thanks for joining us. This is the first time we're doing a leader spotlight. We've done actually a couple of interviews like this, but they were sort of like private, just one-on-one, and then we published the article. But we figured this going forward, we would just have, even if it's a small group of people in the audience, so that we can ask questions and get, make it a little bit more engaging. So today we have our own Lichty. And so we'll talk about his story, his journey, and it's actually a super fun one. Before we get started with that, just really briefly, this is brought to you by TechKnowCon, a community we started a few years ago. It's basically who's school of Silicon Valley technical learning and development, or learning and development technology companies. People behind the scenes that help organize all this is the board. I see Jasmine here, and as well as Tomomi, who is helping run everything, such as the Zoom links and stuff, right? The very important stuff. So thank you, Tomomi. So community guidelines, we're trying to make this be a safe place. So just be nice to one another, respect privacy, do not solicit, be a good citizen, be kind, be objective, all the good stuff. So with that, we are launching, as I mentioned, a new series. And how this is different is that, unlike the Roundtable, which is usually people who practice technical learning and development or run learning and development programs for technical people, we wanted to hear from VPs of engineering. We wanted to hear from people who actually sponsor things like this, and talk about their stories or how they stumbled upon the problems and the challenges for which they then went and funded technical learning and development kind of initiatives. So that's a different kind of take on it. So it's coming from a leader as opposed to from a practitioner. And so, like I said, we're kicking it off. And usually the format of this is I meet up with such VP and talk about a time and place, like a moment in time when they struggled with sharing of knowledge internally and how they went about and resolving that. And so with that, today we have Ron, as I mentioned. So Ron and I, we met a few years back, I would say 4 or 5 years back in person. But it turns out that we crossed paths about 20 some years ago. I'm dating myself here, or even more, right? Early year 2000 or so, 2000, 2001. And we were both at Schwab at the time. We did not know each other, but we were actually probably working in the same building, reporting to the same gentleman at the time. So we kind of crossed paths. And so this is Ron's story. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I wanted to introduce Ron Lichty. Welcome, Ron.
Thanks.
So do you want to maybe tell us a little bit about the time and place? What were you doing, and what was the situation that kind of brought us here?
Yeah, so I got hired into Charles Schwab in 1996. Schwab had brought up web trading for the first time, and in 1996, early in 1996, Schwab brought up web trading, and some of you may remember that in 1996 web browsers were just HTML. I don't think there was any CSS, and I know there wasn't any JavaScript. And in order to do rich internet applications, you had to do something else. And there were two choices at the time, Java and COM. So Microsoft or Sun. And Schwab had decided many months before that it was going to do Java. And the deal at the time was Java applets. My career had been, I cut my teeth, I was a programmer originally. I cut my teeth managing at Apple Computer. I spent 7 years at Apple. I ended up managing the development team that developed the UX of the Macintosh, the continuing UX of the Macintosh Finder. I left there for my first director of engineering role in the entertainment business, Berkeley Systems, which did After Dark, screensavers, flying toasters, fish, moire patterns, all those kinds of crazy things to keep CRT screens from burning in. I spent a little time there, and in two other entertainment companies. I got hired into this financial services company because they were trying to do consumer applications for the first time, and they were really struggling. They had two directors of engineering who had not managed to and they were on the R side. This team that was working in Java was on the R side of R&D. They were doing all research, and there was no delivery. There was no stuff going on. And I stepped in, and I mean, this is a time when Java, if you did a Java applet, you couldn't print anything out of the Java applet because Java applets lived inside the sandbox and printers were outside the sandbox. And so it was a real struggle of, so what are we going to build at Schwab that's going to be a rich internet application and is going to really give value to our consumers, our users, our investors, and what can we build with this Java stuff that's got some real limitations to it. And so I became sort of a conduit between I was the director of engineering, but I was a conduit between product management, or the business, and the development team, which had developed a really good understanding of Java. So that's the setting, Marco.
Yeah, and so I got the years wrong. So this is mid-90s. And just for context, Schwab was, I think, the fastest growing company. Like, somebody drew a line and basically said, if Schwab continues like this, by year 2000, they're going to own all the commercial real estate in San Francisco, right? So it was the hottest company to work at. It was like Salesforce today or something for San Francisco proper.
While I was interviewing with the head of the business unit. So the business unit is Schwab.com. Basically, it was called I forget what it was called. It had a business unit name, but it was basically Schwab.com. And I interviewed with the head of the business unit. I had a warm introduction to him, and he said, "Listen, we've had web trading up for, I think it was 8 months at that point, and every month we forecast what our user base was going to be, what our use was going to be, what the number of hits, the number of trades, the number of it was a trading site." Mm-hmm. And he said every time we would make these fantastic forecasts, and every single month it would exceed that forecast by 2 or 3x, and we were having real trouble keeping servers up. And so that was the context that I walked in. So yes, it was growing really fast. And it was swamping every estimate that anybody was making, every forecast that everybody was making.
Yeah, and so that's Schwab, and then along comes Java, right? And so Sun just releases Java. This is around Java 1. This is the first or second Java 1, right? And that's how I actually got the job at Schwab for the summer as well. And until then, we never had anything dynamic inside of the browser, right? Like, we had Perl-based CGI scripts until that point, right? And so Sun basically releases this runtime that actually runs inside of Mosaic and Netscape browsers.
And so I was still in one of those entertainment companies when Sun released Java, and they had a big event. It was like Java 1.0. It was like the first event around Java, and I was there looking for a technology for this entertainment company. We were building online animated virtual worlds with avatars, and you had an avatar, and it could come interact with the other avatars online, and it was this whole virtual world thing. And Java looked like, here's it's like, oh my gosh, here's a language that's built for the internet. It's built for the internet.
Yep.
And that's part of what got me hired into Schwab, out of the entertainment business of all things.
Yep. And Schwab had this vision for, like, basically providing a financial services app that can actually give you a feedback as you work with it inside of the browser.
What we ended up proposing was an asset allocation tool. Mm-hmm. That our tool, it would download as an applet. You run it. It would bring it from Schwab's mainframes. It would go find out all of your holdings it would create a pie chart for, you know, your holdings that are large cap and small cap and bonds and cash and you know, what's your pie chart look like? And it would ask you, the Schwab had, I think, 7 questions to determine your risk tolerance or risk aversion. And it would show you that pie chart. And this was the days when Schwab made no advice whatsoever. It was in the no advice business. But it would show you those 2 pie charts, and you could make a decision about, oh, gee, you know, I have a ton of high risk here, and my allocation is really high risk, and I'm a really not a very risk tolerant person. Maybe I ought to adjust. You know, you could make those decisions by this application that we created in Java, and it was actually the brokers in the retail branches. I think Schwab had something like 300 retail branches around the country, and the brokers couldn't do that. They didn't have client server applications that could do that. So we were breaking new. We won a bunch of awards for this thing because we were breaking new ground. It seems really simple now, but it was pretty groundbreaking at the time.
Got it. So you're in this like hyper growth company using the cutting edge technology that very few people know, right? So what can possibly go wrong with those 2 combinations?
Right.
So
my developers had to know as much as Sun's developers did, really, in order to make use of that stuff. And they were experimenting in ways that Sun hadn't tried yet, because it was still brand new. And the struggle. So getting into the story that Marco and I talked about, I was I think 2 or 3 months into Schwab when I suddenly realized that other business units, I think there were 5 other groups of software engineers inside of Schwab who were also working in Java, and none of them knew each other. None of them knew that there were other Java developers inside of Schwab. Which in my mind is pathetic.
Yeah, so you have this cutting edge technology that very few people know. There were no books on it, right? Like there was almost like zero support, no books, no courses.
A book from Sun.
A book from Sun, yeah. So that's kind of like the official manual, right?
Yeah.
And so I mean, I can imagine all the challenges you would have, but what did you feel at that point? Like what were your biggest challenges adopting this and actually using it to deliver some value?
Yeah, so the deployment one was a huge. So the printing thing was we figured out a way around the printing thing in order we would create it inside of our Java applet, and then we'd post it over into HTML, and we'd create an HTML page that then you could print the HTML page. So we figured out how to do that, but then the next step was, okay, so how do we deploy this thing? People are calling in on 9600 baud modems at this point. 9600 baud modem for a 300K app, or I forget what size this thing was, but we're looking at how long does that take to go down the modem, and can we break it up, and can we give people enough to see something while the rest of it is flowing in? And you want as many people who are exploring this problem. You want to know what they're learning. You want that shared learning going on, and to know that, to discover that there are 5 other groups who are having the same kinds of problems and who are struggling with the same things. One of them must have figured this out.
Yeah, and so you discovered these groups through grapevine, just sort of like the other developers actually adopting Java, and so there's a potential for shared knowledge and shared understanding. How did you go about actually getting that going? How did you get developers to talk to one another, share what they learned while on the cutting edge?
I created a Java developers cocktail party. I used my budget to rent a room at the Thirsty Bear south of Market in San Francisco. Thirsty Bear is a pub.
Everything happens to the Thirsty Bear. Yeah.
Had an upstairs room, and I bought hors d'oeuvres and a keg of beer. So it wasn't a cocktail party; it was a beer party. But I bought that stuff, and it was 4 o'clock, I think, on some weekday, and invited all those Java developers and got their and talked to their managers and talked to them and we got and I think all of them were there. It's like, hey, here's a freebie. You get to come drink beer and eat hors d'oeuvres and hang out with other Java developers. So it's this upstairs room where we're divided off from everybody else, and there was a milk crate in this room, and I turned the milk crate upside down and made it a stage. So it's a one person, you can fit two feet on it, and made it a stage. And about every 20 minutes, I'd grab somebody from one of the different groups, and I warned them ahead of time, and put them up on that milk crate. And gave them 7 minutes to talk about what they were doing, what they were building, what part of Java technology they were using, which tools they were using, what frameworks, what libraries, what approach they were taking, what architectural patterns they were using, and they got 7 minutes, and then the cane came out and pulled them off, and what was really cool was that the party swirl just changed. Pull that person off, and suddenly, everybody else has just heard that, oh my gosh, they're doing the thing that we're struggling with, and they get swarmed. And then, at the 20 minutes, another person up on stage, and it began to get that. It began to there was this ferment that was going on of exchanging information that should have been going on at the point at which I arrived, but had not happened yet.
So it's the original, it's Ignite style tech talks, right? Like you just basically put people on the stage, they share what they learned rapidly, and then the next person and the next person, and suddenly the whole community sort of starts developing and learning from one another and sort of bettering together, right?
It became the seed of a Java developers group. We called it the Schwab Java Developers Group. Mm-hmm. And it became the seed, and then what happened after that was every time a group finished, mm-hmm. launched, finished a project, we would reserve the Schwab Auditorium and put that team on stage, and I was driving this thing, and I really wanted everybody on the team to get kudos. So it's sort of like a end of sprint demo in Scrum. You want everybody to feel the pride of ownership and the pride of what they'd accomplished, and there's a ton of stuff to be proud about when you're working in technology that early. And figure out how you're going to share the presentation of what it is your team did, and we'd invite everybody else working in Java and anyone who was interested in working in Java to come to that event. And so we had event after event after event going on that year and the subsequent years.
Got it. So your milk crate became much bigger, minus the beer, right? And
we had people finishing stuff, so there was more than just what are we working in, what are we working on, what are we struggling with, but here's how we succeeded.
Got it. So sharing success stories and learning that way. And so when we spoke, I found that your inspiration for this approach very interesting. So how did you come up with like the milk carton and like putting people on crate and putting people on the stage and having them share that? Where did that come from, that idea?
So I think it's in my DNA, and I so for all of the rest of you, I grew up on a farm. I grew up on a 1,000-acre farm in Iowa, and from the time I was yay high, my dad took me along to the lumber yard or the feed store or the halls where farmers gathered, and inevitably, even though we were there to buy feed or buy seed or do something like that, inevitably there'd be other farmers there, and inevitably they talked to each other. And there's probably no group of people more cussedly independent than programmers than farmers. But nonetheless, they talked to each other. They shared with each other what they were doing. They shared with each other what they were trying, and it was a really prosperous community. So they were, we're trying contour farming, or we're putting our rows of corn this much closer, or what's the weight gain on your animals like, and on your livestock like, and what are you feeding them, and what supplements are you giving them? All those kinds of conversations were going on over my head, because I was really short then. But you get a real sense of prosperity coming from these really independent people who are sharing what it is they're doing, what it is they're trying, what's working, what's not working, and I think so. I think it was in my DNA. I started 4-H as soon as I was old enough to do 4-H, and I've got asthma. I'm allergic to almost everything on the farm, but I did electronics projects and found a few compatriots doing electrical and electronics projects.
Yeah, and so I love this story. Basically, seeing something in your childhood that worked, that was inspiring, and that was leading to prosperity, right? Like that's what you mentioned, that farming town was actually very prosperous, and one of the reasons for that was that farmers were willing to share themselves and learn from one another, and through that get better and prosper together. And you and I also
we see that in programming too. The Apple came out of the Apple II. The Apple II came out of the homebrew
computer club. Yeah, homebrew. I think it was
homebrew computer club. Yeah. That was that's a bunch of people struggling to figure out how to build computers, and Steve Wozniak took the best of that and built the Apple II.
Yeah. And you and I also talked about the Renaissance Europe, right, and the Middle Ages, and how that led to prosperity.
One of the, if we continued to operate at Schwab like these little fiefdoms, you get this group of Java developers here, and this group here, and this group here, and they don't talk to each other. I thought of that as like the Middle Ages. It's all these princedoms or fiefdoms around Europe where there wasn't a lot of progress in culture and art and music and those kinds of things. And the Renaissance happened. You have all these bards and musicians and poets and writers who are moving back and forth across Europe, and this flowering of culture and music and writing and literature and all those kinds of things that happened during the Renaissance. And I use that as a metaphor as I got tapped when Schwab in 1999, I guess. In 1999, up until this point, project teams could pick any technology they wanted. So these project teams had picked Java, but there were other ones that had picked Microsoft technologies, and there were other ones who had picked C++, and other ones who had picked, I think we had everything but Spitball and Snowball in our data center. And our CIO owns the data center, not just the programming teams. And she said, this is not a good thing. Maybe we should centralize on a technology. And they picked Java, and they picked me to create a group to support that centralization of technology. And we at that point in 1999, we were up to 30 projects that had been done or were underway in Java. But most of what was being done was still in COM or C++ or C or there's probably some PHP and some CGI and some C and some it's just a plethora of nightmare for the data center.
Yeah, and we're seeing that today, right? Like we're seeing startups sort of be free for all, pick your favorite technology. It was certainly true at Twitter, where somebody went one weekend and decided to use Scala and like started rebuilding everything in Scala, and it was okay to just roll with whatever you want. There was a sense of freedom, and then you get to a certain scale, and you're like, well, we can't run in the same direction anymore if we're all using different tools and different technologies. And that's where kind of the pendulum shifts from pick your own and have the freedom to, hey, we need a little bit of a standardization so that we can together run faster. So it sounds like it was true 25 years ago. It's true today, you know, in a way.
Yeah. So I got to create. So we created the Java Object Services group, and Java Object Services group was maybe somewhat like some of the organizations you all run. We had a group that was focused on bringing on training, and we brought in outside trainers in Java. So we had a group that was focused on training, and we were training COBOL programmers to program in Java. We were really had the sense that we were going to move all entirely into Java, and training COBOL programmers in Java. COBOL programmers were used to just writing their stuff in, you know, originally, you know, you ended up with the computer card, that deck of cards, and you took them into the data center and handed them over the transom to somebody, and somebody else did all that work. And now in the distributed world, you're going to not only program in Java, but you've got to figure out how to make your stuff run in Java, and you've got to run it on development servers and run it on testing servers before it ever gets in pre-production servers before it ever gets over onto a production server. And that's a whole different way of thinking about programming as well. So we had to teach that stuff. We had a Tiger team that when a team ran into trouble, our team wanted support, or a team wanted an understanding of what architecture should they pick, or what library should they use, or what framework should they start with, or what pattern should they use. We had a Tiger team of a half dozen really stellar Java developers who we could parachute into a team to help them out. We created a portal, a knowledge portal, of all of the projects that were going on, and we mapped them out and created essentially a you could go there and find, and you could do a search on our portal and find out anybody else who was using the pattern you were using, or anybody else who was using the IDE you were using, or anybody else who was using the stuff you were using, and who was on that team. And you know, what you're connecting, you know, sort of like a combination of LinkedIn and a wiki in a way. So you find all that stuff, and so for some of those teams that had never used a server before, we had sysadmins who would set up their servers for them. So we had a sort of one-stop shop of you know, we couldn't make you use Java, but we could sure make it a lot easier than using anything else.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, it's not that different than, you know, what today we call DevOps or engineering effectiveness, or I see a lot of similarities. Yeah,
encompassed all those things. Yeah.
And so, okay, so you went from, you know, sort of taking this, what you noticed in this prosperous farming town in Iowa, and you applied it to literally on a milk crate at Thursday Bear for early Java developers, that evolved into an internal Java community that kind of sped the whole knowledge sharing among internal engineers on the cutting edge of this thing that was poorly understood because it was just a cutting edge technology. So what were the results of all this, right? Like, obviously you kind of sped up knowledge transfer and got everyone on the same page, but how did you measure, or how did you observe that, what the results of all that improvement was?
Yeah, we were taking a census all the time of all of the projects that were going on at Schwab, and of what part of them were in Java. And in 1999 there were just 30 of them. 3 years later, there were 350 of them. The percentage was a really small percentage in 1999 of Java out of all of the projects. Our census was not of everything running. Our census was of everything that had been built since Java started, actually, but everything that had been built and or was getting a major revision. And we were up to somewhere around 93-94% of all projects were being done in Java at 3 years later. And we went from 40 Java developers to about 500 over the course of 3 years.
Got it. So there's like an order of a magnitude number of people scale, project scale, adoption scale, like everything just kind of went up 10x or more, right?
Right.
Awesome. And so so what do you see the puck is going? Like what's next in terms of just engineering productivity, or how are companies tackling similar problems today, be it either the cutting edge technology or the internal technology that's poorly, understood by everyone? What do you see? What's happening?
Yeah. So the part of, actually, there's a huge struggle to catch up. The critical mass of Agile happened probably 10 or 12 years ago, and everyone today says, oh yeah, we're using Agile. But you dig into it and you find out that they're using some Agile practices, but not actually being Agile. And the being Agile, I think when teams are being Agile, it creates the best team you've ever worked on. It's that when I talk to tons of developers and tons of development managers and ask, think about the best team you've ever been on, and what are the characteristics of that? And almost to a one, I get either or both, and almost always get both of respect and trust as two of the characteristics of the best team that anybody's ever been on. And so it was really interesting then 5 years ago when Google did its Aristotle study and discovered that psychological safety is at the core of awesome teams, of great teams, of their highest performance teams. That what are the core pieces of psychological safety? Respect and trust. So my mantra for a very long time, my rule of thumb for a very long time, has been that software development is a team sport, and that notion of a daily scrum or a daily stand-up is this notion of, well, if software development's a team sport, maybe we ought to talk to each other at least once a day, and maybe that would be a good idea, and that daily scrum is not intended to be a status meeting. It's intended to be a replanning meeting. Are we on track for what, in Scrum, are we on track for what we're intending to deliver at the end of the sprint? And if we're not, what do we have to do to adjust? How do we in real time make that adjustment? And instead what I'm seeing is, oh, we're all remote from each other, and so let's just put it into Slack, and we'll let some Slack bot take care of it, and it'll be and we're really just sharing status with each other, and we end up never actually doing any replanning or never having each other's backs, or where's the trust and respect part that really is about the coming together and talking with each other once a day.
You touched on something that's kind of relevant nowadays, and that's obviously the remote work. And obviously, in software development, we've sort of had experiences of that sooner than the rest of the kind of economy. But I also remember speaking to Jeff Sutherland, who created Scrum, right? And he would say the communication on a team diminishes drastically as the distance between team members increases over 25 feet. So in other words, if you're like on the other side of the room, even we're gonna just go off the cliff in terms of the quality of communication. So obviously now we're all distributed. So how's that played out?
Yeah, we've got to find ways to bring our people together and build that respect and trust without being in the same room, without passing each other in the hallway, without chatting on the way to get coffee. We've got to find ways to do that. I was in a group where somebody said, "Oh, I'd seen this done before," and I thought, and I was kicking myself for not having remembered it. We have everybody prepare a slide that has a bunch of pictures of their history on it. So you just got my history about growing up on a farm, a bunch of their history on it, and they get 5 minutes to walk everybody. And we're not going to do everybody all at once. We'll do a few people at a time. But people are actually sharing who they are and ideally, to the extent that they're willing, and they're just stuff they're willing to share, stuff to. There are people who are way more hesitant, and people who are just out there. Some of you know people who are just out there. I know some people who are just out there, are willing to share anything. But let people share and as people share and grow trust and respect, they're willing to share more and build the bonds and build the relationships. It's getting people to turn their cameras on while they're doing that, and while they're exchanging information, exchanging core being with each other.
Got it. So it's we need to be just a little bit more, or a lot more deliberate about how we connect with one another, so that there's that human touch that goes beyond just like the Slack text and kind of like exchange higher fidelity information with one another.
Yeah. So it was almost 2 years ago that the pandemic started. Or it started before 2 years ago, but we were suddenly isolated from each other. February 26th was the last time I flew from San Francisco to Seattle, and I've been in Seattle for 699 days. Instead of going back and forth, which is my pattern up until then. And shortly after that, I was on a Zoom call, and somebody said, "We're going to put you in breakout rooms." And the breakout room thing, some of you may have had the experience I did almost 2 years ago, which was being in that breakout room and having a conversation with 4 or 5 people instead of in a large group, and coming back out of it and thinking, wow, there was real intimacy there. More intimacy actually than when we were in large auditoriums and we said, pick the 4 or 5 people around you and have a conversation with them. Because you could hear all those other conversations and you had the sense that they might be able to hear you. So it wasn't just the 4 or 5 of you you're having. In a breakout room, it's just the 4 or 5 of us. And somehow there was a sense of intimacy there that shocked me, actually. I was really surprised by it. And that's what I try to make happen.
Trust, intimacy. Yeah, I remember when you and I spoke, you also said community is a beautiful thing, reflecting on the initial community you started at Schwab that then grew into a Java developers community and so on. So fast forward to today, I know you're involved in a number of engineering communities. Can you tell us a little bit more, like what does that look like and what's your goal with that?
Yeah,
why do you do it?
In the middle, in the aughts, actually in the 90s and the aughts, there was a group in the Bay Area called the Silicon Valley. So it was originally the Software Developers Forum, and it changed its name to SV Forum, the Silicon Valley Forum. But it spawned a bunch of special interest groups, a bunch of SIGs, what now we think of as meetups, since Meetup came along and named it. And I started a software architecture one about 2004, 2005, with a co-chair, and I hate doing logistics, and SD Forum said, we'll do the logistics. You just bring in a speaker and bring people together once a month, and we'll do the logistics for the whole thing. And I'm not a software architect. I'm a software architect groupie. I like hanging out with software architects. I like listening to them. I like hearing what their thinking is. I like being around those brains, and we did that. And I co-chaired that for 5 years, and then I moved on to another one of my interests, was emerging technologies, and I swapped out a co-chair and became a co-chair of the Emerging Technology SIG, and then 5 years after that, I seem to have a pattern. I swapped into yet another of my interests, which is engineering management, and became a co-chair of the engineering management SIG. And SD Forum died. It actually first shut down all of its SIGs, and then it couldn't figure out what it was doing. But we had a community of co-chairs, actually, of the software engineering management SIG. It had become the engineering leadership SIG, and we did a Phoenix Rising thing of, and it's now the Silicon Valley Engineering Leadership Community. It's a meetup. I started one in Seattle since I started co-living in Seattle 5 years ago, maybe. We have grandchildren who are now 7 and 5, and delightful. And thus why I'm in Seattle and not in San Francisco during the pandemic. And I started managing software teams in Seattle, which we just met last night. We had Johanna Rothman speaking to us last night. It was wonderful. And I'm a co-organizer of the Enterprise Agile global community. We were at the Enterprise Agile San Francisco meetup, and now we're at the Enterprise Agile global community, because it's anybody can come from anywhere.
Got it. So,
I'm a member of several other meetups in Agile and in CTO-dom, the CTO group here in Seattle, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see you're embodying the community as a beautiful thing, right? You've been leading a number of communities, and through that, empowering developers and managers and leaders to sort of like rise up and share and learn from one another, and become better at their own craft, and just like humanity has done since the Middle Ages. So I wanted to kind of open it up a little bit and see if anybody from the audience has any questions. Feel free to either speak up, or it's a small group, or type it in a chat. Any questions or comments for Ron?
Me.
Yeah, go ahead, Juan.
This is JC. Juan Carlos. Well, thanks so much, Ron, by sharing this very interesting journey that you had. I have a question. If you have any suggestion or a strategy related with how to train the coaches. In this case, I'm in a scenario where I need to grow the team that I'm building here in Mexico, in Guadalajara. I need to grow in the next 12 months to 150 guys, no? And most of them is going to be freshers, juniors, and team with that kind of, that is going to be my goal, no? My target. And I have let's say 5 to 10 senior engineers, which will help me to coach in different areas, not just in, I will say, like a technical coaching, no? Like in all the technical skills, soft skills, and things like that. Do you have any recommendation?
Yeah, well, getting them coaching, which you probably already thought of. So most of us who are software developers, probably all of you know what Myers-Briggs is. And it took me a long time to discover that most of us who are software developers have the same Myers-Briggs personality. Most of us are INTJs. My I introversion is right on the, actually I'm an extrovert, but only just barely over the line. The skill sets, so the skill sets of extroverts, we can all learn to look like extroverts. We can all learn to do that, but the skill sets don't come to us naturally. And so we need both training and coaching. When I was at Apple, I took some kind of a speaking class, and the class, you got up and you talked to this group, and then they gave you some kind of number of how much you were projecting, right? And so I think I'm just projecting all over the place, and they're giving me 3s, 2s, and maybe I got a 4. And that feedback of just that line, it stands out to me, because I thought I was projecting, but nobody else did. And those of us who are introverts really have to learn that one. And that combination of training and coaching is core. Juan, I don't know if I answered your question or not, but I think that the other piece of this is that everyone in engineering has to realize that moving up the ladder, moving up the chain, has to do with not just technical skill, but communication skill. That ability to communicate what it is you know, and that's how you get to the higher levels in engineering, not just in management, but in senior and principal and the staff engineers. They've got to be able to communicate.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
I think Stuart had a question. Stuart, do you want to speak up?
Yeah, I will lower my hand. Thanks, Rob. One question I had is, could you think back to some of your interactions from your position as like leading engineering to the people organizing learning events, or what would now be a learning team? Can you tell us about that interaction that made it successful, or maybe times that it wasn't successful? Because I'm thinking from the perspective of somebody filling that role, how can I be useful and noticed as useful, appreciated by the leaders in engineering?
Yeah, a lot of conversations, a lot of conversations around here's what we need. So a lot of listening on the part of organizers of learning, of what it is that their leaders and their teams really need, and probably and that translation thing. It's like product management for products. You're the product managers for for learning, and product managers for products have to do that have to do both the listening, what it is that's going to delight our customers, and how do we translate that to what it is they're trying to accomplish, which is not necessarily what they just told us, but it's you know, how does what we can come up with exceed what it is that they were thinking of. You know, it's the Henry Ford, if he asked his customers, they never would have asked for an automobile, they would have asked for a faster horse. And I don't think that's true, but I don't think that's a true story. but I think it's probably a true story from the standpoint of that's probably what they would have said. Steve Jobs for sure said that nobody would have asked for a Macintosh, except the handful of people that ever used a Xerox Star. Nobody ever would have asked for a Lisa or a Macintosh.
So a lot back to communication, right? Talking to people a lot. Yeah, Stuart, does that help? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it speaks importantly to it. I think the challenge then I'm left with is gaining just like those conversations. There's that speaks to have good conversations where you're listening, but when conversations aren't happening regularly, how to start there. It's just requesting hey, I'd like to have a conversation with you often, just being somebody who believes that they're important enough to ask for that conversation.
Yeah, I think it's so you are important enough to ask for that conversation, first of all. And you're important enough in that, you can enable me to increase the capabilities of my teams. And you can only do that if we're in sync. And it was so much easier when we were all in the same building and we could walk past each other. It's socialization. It's that technique, that practice of socialization. When I was hiring for Java developers at Schwab, the recruiting staff was on the same floor as the cafeteria in a 18-story building. And every day, either before I went to the cafeteria, or not every day, but at least every week, before I went to the cafeteria or afterwards, after I came out from lunch, I would make a little swag through the recruiting area to say hello to all the recruiters and see what kind of stuffed animals they had and talk to them about their kids and do that kind of, and it's that socialization thing of, I'm the sweetest guy around. You want to be working on my recruiting problem.
Yep, got it. So Jasmine says thank you, and just reminds us that we're at time. So so I just wanted to thank Ron for sharing all this. It's kind of I love how it's a personal story. It's a timeless story. There's a lot of it doesn't matter if something happened in the Middle Ages or 25 years ago, or it's still relevant today. So a lot of parallels. So thank you for just reinforcing that, to kind of like look at it more holistically, as opposed to this is not just the issue du jour. It's been around for a while, and there are known patterns of how to through community enable knowledge sharing, and through that we all prosper. That's kind of what I got out of that. So it is a beautiful thing. Thank you, Ron.